Israel attacks Beirut following 140 missiles flying into Israel from Lebanon.
So it's definitely a step up in the tensions between Israel and Hezbollah, and the only thing separating it from a complete war is an Israeli ground invasion.
Plus, Vladimir Putin is asking for a larger army. But where will the soldiers come from?
They need to, from their standpoint, win the war and achieve their military objectives, achieve their war aims. And the best way for them to do it is to hire low-cost mercenaries from the global south who are willing to fight and die alongside Russians.
And later, a preview of the UN General Assembly and an exclusive look at the American military footprint in Africa. Today is Friday, September 20th, and this is VOA's Flashpoint. Good evening, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. There's smoke rising over Beirut on Friday afternoon following Israeli airstrikes. This comes after approximately 140 Hezbollah missiles shot into Israel from Lebanon in what looks like an ever-expanding of hostilities. For the latest, I'm joined by VOA's Linda Gradstein in Jerusalem.
Well, the latest is that apparently the senior Hezbollah commander, his name is Ibrahim Akil, he was killed in the Beirut strike, and he was the person who was the target, apparently. He was a senior commander in Hezbollah's Radwan unit, and so this is a pretty big deal. I've also heard him described as the number 2 in Hezbollah after Hassan Nasrallah. At least 3 people were killed in that Israeli strike. And it comes after Hezbollah fired 150 rockets at Israel. Today, there were no casualties, although some fires, it did spark some fires, and the Israeli government told residents of northern Israel to stay close to bomb shelters. Israel launched hundreds of attacks on southern Lebanon. It said it hit hundreds of missile launchers that were really primed to fire at Israel. So it's definitely a step up in the tensions between Israel and Hezbollah, and the only thing separating it from a complete war is an Israeli ground invasion.
Well, I was just about to bring that up. You've mentioned to us in the past that neither Lebanon, Hezbollah, or Israel seem to want a war, yet things keep on getting more and more escalated.
Right, that's true. I mean, also, over the past week, there were these, dozens of people of Hezbollah, mostly Hezbollah members, were killed. I've spoken to Israeli intelligence officials who say it could actually be hundreds of Hezbollah people were killed by these exploding pagers that were apparently manufactured by an Israeli shell company and given out to Hezbollah. There was a second day of explosions of walkie-talkies. And so Hezbollah's command and control capabilities have been disrupted. And several Israeli analysts said that if Israel is really going to launch a complete war against Hezbollah, that this would be the time to do it. At the same time, Hezbollah has rockets that can reach all of Israel. Israel has said that if Hezbollah fires rockets at central Israel, it will then see all of Lebanon, including Lebanese infrastructure, as a target. So if it really does continue to escalate and Israeli ground troops invade Beirut, then you're really talking about a regional war that could bring in, and probably will bring in, Iran and the United States as well.
And changing subjects, some disturbing video coming out of the West Bank on Friday. An Israeli soldier appeared to be pushing dead bodies off a rooftop. What's the story there? What happened?
Well, it's actually 3 Israeli soldiers. This was during an Israeli incursion into the northern West Bank that left 7 gunmen dead. The Israeli government has long said that the northern West Bank is Hamas's center of power in the West Bank, as well as other groups. The incident was apparently filmed by residents of the village of Kabatia, which is near Jenin, and it was witnessed by an AP reporter. And the video shows 3 Israeli soldiers standing on a rooftop, and in one of them, they push a body over the edge of the building. The feet of the body get stuck in what looks like to be either electrical or telephone cables, and it kind of dangles over the edge. And one of the soldiers then reaches over to, get his feet free, and the body tumbles to the ground. Then they take a second body on the roof, and one soldier picks up his hands, another picks up the feet, and they swing it back and forth and then toss it over the side. And a third body is kicked over the side of the building. In a statement, the Israeli army said it's a serious incident that does not coincide with IDF values and the expectations from IDF soldiers, and that they are investigating.
And we'll leave it there for today. VOA's Linda Gradstein in Jerusalem. Linda, thanks for your reporting.
Thank you, Steve.
Following a cabinet meeting on Friday, U.S. President Joe Biden was asked what he thought the Lebanon attacks mean for the peace process.
Thanks so much.
In the peace process, we're continuing to try to do what we tried from the beginning to make sure that both the people in northern Israel as well as southern Lebanon are able to go back to their homes and go back safely. And the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, our whole team is working in the intelligence community to try to get that done. We're going to keep at it till we get it done, but we've got a way to go.
Is it realistic to get to a ceasefire deal, or have too many bad things happen that make it difficult?
If I ever said it's not realistic, we might as well leave. A lot of things don't look realistic until we get them done. We have to keep at it. Thank you.
Thank you, President.
Meanwhile, Russia has warned that the West and Ukraine would face disastrous consequences if they pursued what it calls provocative scenarios against Belarus. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova told reporters that Moscow is concerned by what she called increasingly provocative NATO activity on the border with Belarus, saying she would not rule out that there could be attempts to escalate in the region. Zakharova also reminded reporters that Russia has deployed tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. In other Russia-Ukraine news, Moscow's decision this week to expand its military capabilities is a sign of the stress that its military is facing in the third year of its slow-moving, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Analysts say the mobilization's unpopularity and other factors are driving Russia to look for help from elsewhere. Marcus Harton narrates this report from Ricardo Marquinhos.
On September 16th, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a decree to raise the size of the Russian army by 180,000 troops to 2.38 million soldiers, the world's second largest after China. Kremlin officials say the increase is due to its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but also to respond to what Moscow describes as threats from NATO on its western flank. Russia 2 years ago called a massive mobilization that brought 300,000 soldiers into its army. But analysts say Russian leaders are having to try a different route this time. Natia Seskaria, Associate Fellow at London's Royal United Services Institute.
A mobilization that was announced by President Putin was quite unpopular inside Russia. Russia has been recruiting from other nations such as India, Nepal, Indonesia. From open sources, what we know is that these people are usually those who are unemployed, and they are willing to accept these financial incentives.
Investigative reporting by independent media, including the Moscow Times and the Kyiv Independent, found that agents have promised fighting-age people relatively high salaries in countries such as Sri Lanka, Indonesia, India, and Nepal. The Kremlin has never confirmed or denied such practices. The reports say those recruited abroad would not be assigned to mercenary forces like the Wagner Group, but to the regular Russian army. Mark Hanna is a senior fellow at the Institute for Global Affairs in New York.
They need to, from their standpoint, win the war and achieve their military objectives, achieve their war aims. And the best way for them to do it is to hire low-cost mercenaries from the global south who are willing to fight and die alongside Russians.
The number of casualties in this war continues to rise. The Wall Street Journal reports the total number of soldiers and civilians killed or wounded on both sides has already reached 1 million people. Western intelligence sources say 600,000 of them have been Russian. For Ricardo Martina, Marcus Harden, VOA News.
The war in Ukraine and the fighting in Gaza will both be on the agenda as world leaders gather for the United Nations General Assembly starting this Sunday. VOA's UN correspondent Margaret Bashir has more.
This year's United Nations General Assembly will take place against a bleak global backdrop. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres.
We see out-of-control geopolitical divisions and runaway conflicts, not least in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, and beyond.
The Gaza war is approaching its one-year anniversary, with more than 41,000 Palestinians killed and 100 hostages taken from Israel still in Hamas captivity. But progress toward a ceasefire is unlikely at the UN gathering. Randa Slim is a senior fellow at the Washington-based Middle East Institute.
I don't see much traction. I think both sides, in this case Hamas and the Israeli Prime Minister, seem to be gearing up for a protracted war, protracted conflict.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas are certain to focus on the war when they address the General Assembly on Thursday. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is also expected in New York. More than 2.5 years after Russia invaded Ukraine, peace remains elusive. Zelensky is likely to make his case for more military support and long-range weapons during a Security Council meeting on Ukraine on Tuesday and at the General Assembly on Wednesday. Richard Gowan is the UN Director for the International Crisis Group.
For Ukraine now, the big challenge is to stop Russia advancing in eastern Ukraine. The future of the war will be decided on the battlefield, not in the UN.
Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be coming to New York, but veteran Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will. Diplomats will also meet to discuss the war in Sudan. Despite multiple international initiatives, there has been no ceasefire, and 17 months of fighting has displaced over 10 million people and pushed millions more into hunger. New faces at the UN this month include British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. And U.S. President Joe Biden will make his final UN appearance. Again, Richard Gowan.
I think there is still some respect for his engagement with multilateralism, but I think there's also a lot of regret that he didn't give the UN a greater role in dealing with the war in Gaza.
Following 2 assassination attempts on former President Donald Trump, VOA asked if the United States could guarantee the safety of more than 130 presidents and prime ministers who will be coming to New York City. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield.
We have pulled out all the stops. New York City has police everywhere. Diplomatic security is supporting Secret Service to also provide security for all the heads of state who will be here in town.
The Secretary General will kick off the Marathon Week of Diplomacy Sunday with a 2-day-long Summit of the Future, which aims to reform the UN system to handle new challenges, including climate change and artificial intelligence. Again, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres.
We can't create a future fit for our grandchildren with systems built for our grandparents.
Negotiations on a substantive pact for the future have been difficult, but it is expected to be adopted. Margaret Bashir, VOA News, the United Nations.
You're listening to Flashpoint from the Voice of America. I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Sri Lankans are headed to the polls and will go to Colombo to find out if the current administration's economic successes are enough for another win. That story coming up. Now, though, on Sunday, U.S. Africa Command's Major General Kenneth Ekman was one of the last 2 U.S. service members to leave Niger as part of America's military withdrawal following the country's July 2023 coup. Per the agreement reached by the U.S. and Niger in May, the only American service members that remain in the country are those securing the U.S. Embassy. The American withdrawal was completed on time and within the parameters set by the host nation, but the withdrawal has also created a massive hole in the United States' ability to monitor the growing violent extremist threat in the Sahel. In an exclusive interview with VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb, General Ekman explains how the new U.S. footprint in West Africa, including in Chad, is beginning to take shape to continue fighting a shared threat.
I want to ask you your response to something that retired General Marcus Hicks said recently. He said that losing Niger means that we've lost our ability to directly influence counterterrorism and counterinsurgency in the Sahel. Is that true?
Yeah. So in a regional approach, if there was one country that was most important on our ability to address Sahelian VEO problems, or the Sahelian VEO challenge, it was Niger. So for one of Niger, I talked about it as a strategic setback. The degree to which that setback endures ties to how we reposition and then what our partners want to do with us. So I agree with him in principle, but that is a snapshot in time. All is not lost in where AFRICOM is focused, where the department is focused, and frankly where the interagency is focused, is what do we do next, because our security objectives haven't changed.
What's going on with Chad? Have we come to an agreement where U.S. forces are back, or are they going to return soon? Can you update us on that?
Yeah, thanks. So as you probably followed, we did remove about 70 U.S. Special Forces personnel at the end of April. That was at their request. They asked us to leave. An election was coming, and we obliged. That's what partners do. Since then, they had a successful election on the 6th of May. And so in the aftermath of that, they've started asking us, well, what can we do together? Our goal is to do something less than we had there before. We had a headquarters there before, but we have reached an agreement on the return of a limited number of Special Forces personnel. It is a presidential decision, so these are big policy decisions. It was a presidential decision by President Deby, but the decision is made, and now we're working through the specifics on how we return.
When did that occur?
Yeah, so the election was on the 6th of May. His decision was conveyed to us in just recent weeks. But, and as you raised Chad, it's really important because this is how it's an outside-in strategy. And the direction of approach from Chad is immensely important. They've also been a significant contributor to Sahelian security, if nothing else, through the Multinational Joint Task Force, which is a foreign nation oriented on VEO's task force that supports the Lake Chad Basin. And so what we do with them and what our future relationship is with them post-election is also an important matter.
Well, and also people who have been in the region stress to me that this is not a problem. Violent extremism cannot be solved by one party or even just bilateral relationships. It has to be a community effort. And there's a concern that with all of these coups and with France pulling out, Germany pulling out, the United States pulling out, that the community effort is falling apart. How does the U.S. hope to counter that, and how are you working with the partners to try to glue everybody back together to remain focused on a common threat?
Yeah, thanks. You raise a lot of points in that. So one, a regional threat must be confronted by regional countries working together. The consequence of the Niger coup, the consequence of the so-called AES states separating from ECOWAS, that is added to regional disintegration, right? Transnational threats know no boundaries, right, by definition. And so our part that we can do within that, one, AFRICOM on behalf of DoD has some convening power. You talked about it earlier. When and how do we bring different nations together to exercise, right? How do we do intel sharing that transcends national boundaries? That's a really important part. Everything else we actually do bilaterally, right? So how do we work with this country bilaterally? That as you add the pieces of that, translate into something that's coherent with regards to an overall regional approach. We can't do it for them. What I mean by that is U.S. presence, but also the diminishing presence of U.S. allies, the diminishing presence of multilateral organizations. It's ultimately going to come down to the agency and the commitment of each African partner to deal with this growing regional threat.
A brief editorial note. The general said there was an agreement with Chad. The Pentagon later clarified that he used the word agreement in context that an understanding for our presence was established, and that next steps as to what that presence would look like remain to be decided. For more of Carla's interview, log on to voanews.com. Now to South Asia, where Sri Lanka will hold elections for a new president on Saturday in the first polls since massive popular protests ousted the former president at the height of a crushing economic downturn. It's a pivotal vote for the country, where the new leader will have to steer the island nation towards economic revival and ensure political stability. Anjana Pasricha has this report.
As he prepares to vote for a new president, ice cream parlor owner Tariq Naseem in Sri Lanka's capital Colombo echoes the rallying cry at massive protests 2 years ago when an economic collapse led to the ouster of former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa.
My expectation is we need a system change, full system change.
The country's 17 million voters will choose between three main contenders as discontent festers in the country. President Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was elected by Parliament, is running as an independent candidate. His main challengers are opposition leader Sajith Premadasa and Anura Dissanayake, head of a Marxist-led coalition. Paikyasothi Saravanamutu is executive director at the Centre for Policy Alternatives in Colombo.
Major issue in this election is corruption, and they want a change of the system, which is what the Argalaya called for. A change of the system means that they don't want the old ways where there was no transparency, no accountability.
Wickremesinghe is wooing voters with the promise of building on the fragile economic recovery he has steered. He secured an International Monetary Fund bailout, which pulled Sri Lanka back from bankruptcy, eased severe food and fuel shortages, and lowered runaway inflation. Saravanamutu again.
Those who believe, therefore, that he's gone to the IMF, he's got to deal with them, that we should continue and get out of the terrible mess that we've got ourselves in and then start to rebuild again.
But millions want less of the hardships they are suffering. Wickremesinghe slashed subsidies and imposed higher taxes because of IMF austerity measures. Living costs have surged. A quarter of the country is reeling under poverty. Small businesses like those of fruit seller Ranjit Dias in Colombo are hurting.
Business has fallen right to the bottom. It will be very difficult to recover. Our profits have dropped by half. People don't have money to buy these fruits.
Wickremesinghe is also seen as part of the old political guard, which protesters sought to overthrow. The anger with traditional parties has led to growing support for Disanayake's alliance, called the National People's Power. His rallies have attracted huge crowds. Alan Keenan is senior consultant Sri Lanka at the International Crisis Group.
Very popular with a lot of Sri Lankans. They've never really been in power themselves, so they are presenting themselves as the party that can come in and sweep out the old guys and particularly end corruption, which is a big problem in Sri Lanka and which many Sri Lankans blame for the economic crisis.
Opposition leader Premadasa, who is also promising economic relief, is steering a middle path between the status quo that Wickremesinghe represents and the radical change promised by Dissanayake. A significant number of uncommitted voters is making it hard to forecast the outcome of a crucial election, which will shape how Sri Lanka copes with the challenge of ensuring political and economic stability. Anjana Pasricha, VOA News, New Delhi.
And that's going to wrap up today's show. There's more VOA coverage 24 hours a day on our website, voanews.com, and across our social media platforms. On behalf of everyone here at VOA, thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Steve Karish.
For deeper dives and expert analysis, listen to VOA Podcasts. Issues in the News explores the biggest stories every weekend, while International Edition keeps you informed every weekday. Plus, with the 5-minute newscast at the top of every hour, you're always up to date.